We're going to look at the transport of carbon dioxide in the blood in this lecture. So carbon dioxide is going to be transported in the blood in 3 different ways. So this is really important to know, so make sure you star this. 7% of the carbon dioxide will be dissolved in the plasma, and that makes the blood partial pressure of carbon dioxide. So we have more carbon dioxide dissolved in the plasma than we do oxygen, because carbon dioxide is more soluble in the blood than oxygen is, but it's still not very soluble. There's only 7% that's dissolved in the plasma. The rest of the carbon dioxide will enter into the red blood cells, where 23% will bind to the hemoglobin, and remember that forms the carbaminohemoglobin. And then the majority of the carbon dioxide is going to be converted into bicarbonate ions, which is HCO3-, and that will be moved out of the red blood cells into the plasma. So the majority of the carbon dioxide will be transported as bicarbonate ions in the plasma. This picture shows the 3 different ways that carbon dioxide is transported in the blood. 7% will dissolve in the plasma, but the majority of the carbon dioxide will diffuse into the red blood cells, where 23% will bind to the hemoglobin, forming the carbaminohemoglobin. Remember that the carbon dioxide binds to the amino acids on the protein part of the hemoglobin. It does not bind to the heme group. The majority of the carbon dioxide, though, is going to be converted to bicarbonate ions, and that will then be shifted out into the plasma where the bicarbonate ions will be transported. So to start this, really important to know how the majority of oxygen and carbon dioxide are transported in the blood. Most of the oxygen is going to be bound to the heme group on the hemoglobin. And then for carbon dioxide, most of it is going to be dissolved as bicarbonate ions in the plasma. This chemical reaction occurs inside the red blood cells and is really important to know, so make sure you star this. So we have carbon dioxide and water that are going to combine together and form carbonic acid. And it does this with the assistance of the enzyme carbonic anhydrase. Carbonic anhydrase is found inside the red blood cells. And then the carbonic acid will fall apart and dissociate into hydrogen ions and bicarbonate ions. And the reaction can also go in the reverse direction, so it can go either way. Let's take a look at what happens in the tissues. In the tissues, the carbon dioxide levels are high because the tissues have been working hard making ATP, breaking down the food, and generating lots of CO2. So if the partial pressure of carbon dioxide is high, that's going to push the reaction to the right according to the law of mass action. And if the reaction goes to the right, we're going to be producing lots of hydrogen ions. And if you increase the amount of hydrogen ions, that's going to decrease the pH, so it makes it more acidic. If you're in the lungs, remember that the inhaled air has very little carbon dioxide. So the partial pressure of carbon dioxide is low in the lungs, so the reaction is going to go to the left, so it's going to go this reverse direction. So if the reaction is going in the reverse, going to the left, notice that these hydrogen ions are going to disappear by the time you get over here to make carbon dioxide and water. So at a low partial pressure of carbon dioxide, the hydrogen ions decrease, and if the hydrogen ions are decreasing, the pH will increase because it's becoming more basic or alkaline. And the body actually uses this chemical reaction in the blood to help with the acid-base balance. Let's take a look at carbon dioxide loading in the tissues. So in the tissues, we've got lots of carbon dioxide, so that's going to drive this reaction to the right. And let's take a look at what happens in a picture. Here's our tissues with the partial pressure of carbon dioxide of 46 millimeters of mercury. And out in our systemic arterial blood, we've got a partial pressure of carbon dioxide at 40 millimeters of mercury. So carbon dioxide is just going to diffuse down the partial pressure gradient, going from high to low, and diffuse from the tissues into the blood. When the carbon dioxide gets into the blood, about 7% of the carbon dioxide will remain dissolved in the plasma, but the rest of the carbon dioxide will enter into the red blood cells. 23% will bind to the hemoglobin, to one of the amino acids on the protein part of the hemoglobin, and that will cause the carbamino effect. So remember, when carbon dioxide binds to hemoglobin, then the hemoglobin doesn't bind to oxygen as well. So when carbon dioxide binds to hemoglobin at the tissue, it helps kick the oxygen off the hemoglobin and unload it so it can go into the tissues. The majority of the carbon dioxide, 70% though, is going to be converted with the water and using that carbonic anhydrase enzyme into carbonic acid, which will then dissociate and form bicarbonate ions and hydrogen ions. We need to keep getting rid of the hydrogen ions and bicarbonate ions to keep this chemical reaction going to the right. Because if the hydrogen ions and bicarbonate ions started to build up, then the reaction would go in the reverse, and that's not what we want. So to get rid of the hydrogen ions are going to bind to the protein part of the hemoglobin. And remember, this is the Bohr effect. So when the hydrogen ions bind to the hemoglobin, that makes the hemoglobin not bind to the oxygen as well. And so that'll increase the unloading of oxygen at the tissue, which is what we want. To get rid of the bicarbonate ions, we're going to move them out into the plasma. And we're going to transport them with a chloride ion, so they're going to go opposite directions. So this is called a chloride shift. So moving the bicarbonate ions out and chloride ions in to the red blood cell, that's called the chloride shift. Let's take a look at carbon dioxide unloading in the lungs. So in the alveoli, the partial pressure of carbon dioxide is going to be low because the carbon dioxide levels in the inhaled air is low. And that's going to push the chemical reaction to the left. And let's take a look at a picture to see what happens in the lungs. The partial pressure of carbon dioxide in the pulmonary arterial blood coming into the lung capillaries is at 46. And the partial pressure of carbon dioxide in the alveoli is at 40. So carbon dioxide is just going to diffuse down its partial pressure gradient from high to low from the blood into the lungs. And then we're just going to do the reverse of everything that we just showed you in the tissues. So we need to move the bicarbonate ions back into the red blood cells, because remember, the majority of the carbon dioxide is out here transported as bicarbonate ions in the plasma. So we're just going to do a chloride shift going the other direction to move the bicarbonate ions back inside the red blood cells. And then we need to get the hydrogen ions back off the hemoglobin. So the hydrogen ions get kicked off the hemoglobin, and that's again the Bohr effect. So when the hydrogen ions leave the hemoglobin, it makes it easier for the hemoglobin to bind to oxygen. So that'll increase the oxygen loading of the hemoglobin in the lungs, which is what we want. And now that we have the hydrogen ions and bicarbonate ions back, we can combine them to form carbonic acid. And then the carbonic anhydrase enzyme that's inside the red blood cells will catalyze the reaction to turn the carbonic acid into water and carbon dioxide. And then this carbon dioxide will then just diffuse across into the alveoli. Remember that we also had 23% of the carbon dioxide bound to the hemoglobin as our carbaminohemoglobin. So now that the partial pressure of carbon dioxide is much lower in the lungs, the carbon dioxide will come off of the hemoglobin, and that will form the carbamino effect, because remember, when we have less carbon dioxide bound to the hemoglobin, the oxygen can bind better to the hemoglobin. So that will increase oxygen loading at the lungs, which is what we want. And then about 7% of the carbon dioxide, remember, was just dissolved in the plasma as CO2, and that also will diffuse out into the lungs. And then this picture is nice because it shows the carbon dioxide unloading in the lungs and carbon dioxide loading in the tissues side by side, so you can see them both together. And then we have the Haldane effect. So we saw before the carbamino effect, where carbon dioxide affects how well hemoglobin binds to oxygen. The Haldane effect is just the opposite of the carbamino effect. The Haldane effect is the effect of oxygen on a hemoglobin's affinity to bind to carbon dioxide. So when oxygen binds to hemoglobin, it decreases hemoglobin's affinity for carbon dioxide. So in the lungs, where the partial pressure of oxygen is high, that means that more oxygen will be bound to the hemoglobin and less carbon dioxide will be bound to the hemoglobin. So in the lungs, the oxygen loading onto the hemoglobin facilitates the unloading of carbon dioxide from the hemoglobin. And then in the tissues, where the partial pressure of oxygen is low, there's going to be more carbon dioxide bound to the hemoglobin because there's less oxygen bound to the hemoglobin. So in the tissues, oxygen unloading from the hemoglobin facilitates carbon dioxide loading onto the hemoglobin. And this is just a picture of the Haldane effect. So if you take a look at a particular partial pressure of carbon dioxide, and then if you just vary the partial pressure of oxygen, you can see that the amount of carbon dioxide that's able to be transported on the hemoglobin is very different. So in the lungs, where the partial pressure of oxygen is at 100, we can't have as much carbon dioxide bound to the hemoglobin as we do in the tissues. So in the tissues, the partial pressure of oxygen is much lower at 40, and so with less oxygen bound to the hemoglobin, more carbon dioxide can bind. So that's the Haldane effect. I would spend some time looking at these flowcharts. They're really important to understand everything that's going on with the interactions between the carbon dioxide and the oxygen. So let's take a look in the tissues. So in the tissues, the carbon dioxide levels are high. So because the partial pressure of carbon dioxide is high, that's going to load more carbon dioxide onto the hemoglobin. And if more carbon dioxide is loaded onto the hemoglobin, that means the hemoglobin will not bind to the oxygen as well and will increase oxygen unloading, and that's the carbamino effect. And then also with high levels of carbon dioxide at the tissues, remember that our chemical reaction down here on the bottom will go to the right, and so we're going to produce a lot more hydrogen ions in the tissue. So with an increase in the hydrogen ions or a decrease in the pH, it's more acidic. With the hydrogen ions increase, they will bind the hemoglobin, and that will decrease the hemoglobin's affinity for oxygen. So that'll increase the oxygen unloading. And remember, the effect of pH on hemoglobin's affinity for oxygen is the Bohr effect. And then also in the tissues, we have low oxygen levels. So because the partial pressure of oxygen is low, that means that more oxygen will be unloaded from the hemoglobin. And then with less oxygen that is on the hemoglobin, that will allow more carbon dioxide to bind to the hemoglobin. So that's the Haldane effect. And then in the lungs, just the opposite happens. So in the lungs, the partial pressure of carbon dioxide is low. And with carbon dioxide levels low, that will increase the carbon dioxide unloading from the hemoglobin, which now with the carbon dioxide gone, hemoglobin can bind to the oxygen better, and that'll increase oxygen loading. So that's the carbamino effect. And then also because the carbon dioxide levels are low, with our chemical reaction here, if CO2 levels are low, that will drive the reaction to the left. So there'll be less hydrogen ions. And with less hydrogen ions, that will increase hemoglobin's affinity for binding to oxygen, and that'll increase the oxygen loading in the lungs, and that's the Bohr effect. And then also the oxygen levels are high, and if they're high, that will increase the oxygen loading onto the hemoglobin. And then with high oxygen, with more oxygen bound to the hemoglobin, that will increase the carbon dioxide unloading from the hemoglobin, and that's the Haldane effect. And here's just a summary of the 3 effects we talked about, so make sure you star these and keep these straight for the exam. The Bohr effect, just remember that the word Bohr has an H in it, and so does pH. So that'll help you remember that the Bohr effect is the effect of pH on hemoglobin's affinity for oxygen. The carbamino effect is easy to remember because you've got carbon dioxide in the name, And remember that it binds to the amino acid or protein part of the hemoglobin. So the carbamino effect is the effect of the partial pressure of carbon dioxide on hemoglobin's affinity for oxygen. And then the Haldane effect is just the opposite of the carbamino effect. It's the effect of the partial pressure of oxygen on hemoglobin's affinity for carbon dioxide.